Welcome back. We finally made it here. It took a while, but we're in probably the most exciting section, at least for me. We're going to be talking about object-oriented programming and functional programming. Both of these are what we call programming paradigms. Object-oriented programming and functional programming are paradigms that allow us to organize code in a way that is easy to reason about. What does that really mean? By the end of this section, after we've done talking about OOP and FP, my goal is that you realize these benefits. One is that by using these paradigms, we're going to make code more clear and more understandable. We're going to make code easy to extend. That is, as our app grows, as our programs grow, as the number of developers working on a project grow, it's easier to extend using these programming paradigms. I'm also going to convince you how it's easier to maintain by multiple programmers. It's going to be memory efficient. And then finally, it's going to keep our code dry. That is, we won't repeat ourselves. Our code is going to be nice and clean, and we're going to have all these benefits because of these programming paradigms. And that's what programming paradigms are. It allows us to make complex code more organized. Now, before we even had OOP and FP, we had, machine code, right? Initially, it was all ones and zeros that programmers used. And then as time passed, we went into something called procedural style of programming. And a procedural style of programming is that, we did what computers want us to do. That is, we would store data and then manipulate that data using some sort of functions. But there was no structure or organization. We just had step-by-step instructions of, hey, computer, put memory here. Hey, computer, move this memory here. Hey, computer, change the memory here and then give me this. Everything was procedural. And I'll link to this Wikipedia article, which I think is really, really interesting if you want to give it a go. As I said before, initially we started with some very basic programming languages. Really low-level languages. We had things like BASIC, assembly language, COBOL. And then throughout the 60s and 70s, a big change happened. We started establishing these fundamental paradigms. How can you write code in a more organized fashion so it wasn't as procedural? That's when object-oriented programming and functional programming started to really take effect. We had languages like Scheme, which we've mentioned was one of the inspirations of JavaScript. We had languages like Smalltalk that really popularized this idea of object-oriented programming as a way to organize this code. And then finally, in the 80s, as more and more best practices start to happen, we started having more of a consolidation. That is, people agreeing on what some good patterns are. We had things like modules that, once again, we'll talk about and we have a section on. Object-oriented programming really started taking off. You see, we had languages like C++ that came into existence. And C++ was simply the original C language with classes. Classes which allowed us to do object-oriented programming. We had Objective-C. As the name suggests, it was a C-based language inspired by the idea of objects and object-oriented programming. And that really started to take effect. But at the same time, in the background, we also had functional programming. In the 90s, with the age of the internet, we started having more languages. Java became extremely popular with their object-oriented paradigm. We had JavaScript that came as the language of the web, and many other languages that we're familiar with. Now, object-oriented programming kept up with the trends and was really, really popularized by things like Java. However, now we see a trend towards functional programming languages becoming more and more popular, mostly because of the way that the paradigm works and how well it works with concurrent and distributed programming. Again, something that we'll touch on later on. I highly recommend you go through this article. It is really, really fascinating. But the whole point of this was that as the years progress, programmers, as we worked more and more with code, we start to develop an idea of what are good practices, what should we do. And object-oriented programming and functional programming were the two strong paradigms that evolved. So by learning these two things, we get to stand on shoulders of giants. We get to learn what are the good practices that all these programmers that came before us learned, that they made mistakes and then they've changed in the way that they program so that we write better code. And in this section, we're going to do just that. We're going to learn from everybody's mistake in the past. We're going to learn from all the ideas and all the ways that we can write better programs. I hope that gets you excited. It definitely does for me. And I'll see you in the next video.